The morning mist clung to the banks of the Chickahominy River like morning veils, and Martha Whitfield pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders as she watched her two children gather smooth stones along the water's edge. The Virginia countryside bore the scars of 3 years of war. Burned fields, broken fences, and the hollow eyes of those who remained. She had brought little Samuel and Rebecca here every Sunday since their father's funeral, a ritual that gave her children some measure of peace in a world that had forgotten what that word meant. At 32, Martha had aged beyond her years. Her auburn hair, once her pride, now hung in a simple braid beneath her black bonnet, and her hands bore the calluses of a woman who had learned to split wood, mend fences, and harvest what little grain the scorched earth would yield. The consumption that had taken hold in her lungs after the brutal winter of 1863 left her breathless most days, but she hid her weakness from Samuel, now 10, and Rebecca, barely 8. If you're finding yourself drawn into this story of survival and unexpected encounters during our nation's darkest hour, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. These tales of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances deserve to be shared and remembered. The children's laughter echoed across the water as they skipped stones, momentarily forgetting the weight of their circumstances. Martha allowed herself a rare smile, remembering how Thomas used to show Samuel the proper technique, his large hands guiding their son's small fingers. The memory brought its familiar ache, but she'd learned to carry grief like she carried everything else, with quiet determination and an iron will that surprised even herself. "Mama, look!" Rebecca called out, her voice bright with discovery. "There's a man by the old oak tree." Martha's blood chilled as she followed her daughter's pointing finger. Across the narrow bend in the river, partially hidden by the drooping branches of an ancient oak, stood a figure in the distinctive blue uniform of the Union Army. Even from this distance, she could see the gold trim that marked him as an officer. Her first instinct was to gather her children and run, but something in his posture, the way he stood with his head bowed, his cap in his hands, gave her pause. The officer seemed to sense her gaze and looked up, revealing a face marked by the particular weariness that belonged to men who had seen too much death. He appeared to be in his 30s, with dark hair and a beard that had been trimmed with military precision despite the obvious exhaustion in his bearing. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other across the water, two souls caught in the strange suspension of recognition without introduction. "Children," Martha said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that had kept her family alive through the worst of times. "Come away from the water's edge." But the officer was already moving, walking along the bank with deliberate steps, until he reached the fallen log that served as a bridge during low water. Martha's heart hammered against her ribs as he crossed, each step bringing him closer to her small family. She positioned herself between him and her children, though she knew that if he meant harm, her slight frame would offer little protection. "Ma'am," the officer said as he approached, his voice carrying a northern accent that seemed foreign in this Virginia landscape. "I don't mean to intrude on your Sunday observance. My name is Captain James Morrison of the 14th Connecticut Infantry." His formality struck her as oddly comforting, a reminder that even in war, some men maintained their civility. She inclined her head slightly, but did not offer her name in return. In her experience, the less Yankees knew about Confederate families, the safer those families remained. Captain Morrison seemed to understand her reticence. He reached into his breast pocket with careful, deliberate movements, making no sudden gestures that might alarm her. What he withdrew made Martha's world tilt on its axis, a simple gold band that caught the morning light and sent it dancing across the water like scattered prayers. "I believe," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name, "this belonged to your husband." Martha's legs nearly gave way beneath her. She knew that ring as well as she knew her own heartbeat, the small dent near the engraving where Thomas had struck it against a fence post in their early married days, the way it had worn thin from years of honest work. She had slipped it from his cold finger herself before they lowered him into the ground at Gettysburg, or so she had thought. "Where did you get that?" The words escaped her lips as barely a whisper. Captain Morrison's face was grave as he held the ring between them, not yet offering it, but not withdrawing it either. "From a Confederate soldier I found dying near Little Round Top. He gave it to me with his final breath, along with a message." The morning seemed to grow colder around them. Samuel and Rebecca had stopped their play, sensing the weight of the adult conversation, even if they couldn't understand its full meaning. Martha's mind raced through possibilities, each more troubling than the last. Thomas had been buried with his ring, she was certain of it. Yet here stood this Union officer, holding evidence that suggested otherwise. "What message?" she asked, though part of her feared the answer. Captain Morrison glanced at the children, then back at her face, which had gone pale as parchment. "Perhaps we might speak privately, Mrs. Whitfield," she found herself saying, the name slipping out before caution could stop it. "These are my children, Samuel and Rebecca." The captain nodded gravely to each child in turn, treating them with the same respect he might show adults. Samuel puffed up slightly at being acknowledged as the man of the family, while Rebecca moved closer to her mother's skirts. "Mrs. Whitfield, the message I was given is of a delicate nature. It might be better discussed away from young ears." Martha's protective instincts warred with her desperate need to understand how this stranger had come to possess her husband's ring. She looked at her children, then at the officer's earnest face, and made a decision that would change everything that followed. "Samuel, take your sister and collect some of those wildflowers by the big rock. Stay where I can see you, but give us a few minutes to speak." Samuel, old enough to understand the gravity in his mother's voice, nodded seriously and took Rebecca's hand. As they moved away, chattering quietly to each other, Martha turned back to Captain Morrison with steel in her spine, despite the weakness in her lungs. "Now, sir, tell me what you know about my husband's death." Captain Morrison studied her face for a moment, perhaps measuring her strength against the weight of what he was about to reveal. When he spoke, his words carried the careful precision of a man who had rehearsed this conversation in his mind many times. "The soldier I found was not your husband, Mrs. Whitfield. His name was Private Daniel Hartwell of the 37th Virginia Infantry. He was young, perhaps 19, with fair hair and green eyes." Martha's breath caught. She knew that description, knew it as well as she knew her own reflection. Daniel Hartwell had been Thomas's closest friend since boyhood, practically a brother, and had stood as best man at their wedding. He had enlisted alongside Thomas in the early days of the war, full of righteous fire and Confederate pride. "Daniel," she whispered, "but how did he come to have Thomas's ring?" The captain's expression grew even more grave. "According to Private Hartwell's final words, your husband didn't die at Gettysburg, Mrs. Whitfield. He died 3 days earlier in a skirmish near Frederick, Maryland. Private Hartwell was with him when he passed." The world seemed to spin around Martha. She reached out blindly and found the rough bark of a pine tree to steady herself. Thomas hadn't died in the great battle that everyone spoke of with such reverence and horror. He had died alone, far from the glory and recognition that Gettysburg would bring to so many others. "Why?" she managed to ask. "Why would Daniel let me believe?" Captain Morrison's voice grew gentle, though it carried the weight of hard truth. "Private Hartwell said your husband made him promise to take his place in the regiment, to let the record show that Thomas Whitfield died at Gettysburg with honor, not in some forgotten skirmish that would be lost to history. Your husband was worried about his pension, about what you and the children would receive if he died in a minor engagement rather than a major battle. The practical nature of Thomas's deception was so like him that Martha almost smiled, despite her shock. Even facing death, her husband had been thinking about how to provide for his family, how to ensure that his widow would receive the maximum benefit from his sacrifice. "But Daniel," she said, "what happened to Daniel?" "He took your husband's name and identity, became Thomas Whitfield in the regimental records. That's why the official reports showed your husband dying at Gettysburg, because Daniel Hartwell died there, fighting under your husband's name." Martha's mind struggled to process this revelation. The funeral she had attended, the grave marker she visited, the pension she received, all of it was built on a fiction created by two young men who had loved each other like brothers. "Private Hartwell carried your husband's ring for 2 years, Mrs. Whitfield. He wore it inside his shirt, close to his heart. When I found him, he was using his last breath to make me promise to find you and tell you the truth. He said, 'You deserve to know that Thomas died thinking of you and the children, and that he had died with honor, even if not in the place or manner the records would show.' The captain extended the ring toward her, and Martha took it with trembling fingers. It was warm, from being carried next to the officer's chest, and she could see that it had been cared for, polished regularly, despite the harsh conditions of military life. "There's more, Mrs. Whitfield. Private Hartwell gave me something else before he died." Captain Morrison reached into another pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, worn soft from handling. The paper bore the familiar slant of Thomas's handwriting, and Martha's heart clenched with recognition. "Your husband wrote this letter the night before the skirmish near Frederick. He gave it to Private Hartwell with instructions to send it to you if anything happened to him. But when Daniel took Thomas's identity, he couldn't send it without raising questions. He kept it instead, reading it whenever he felt lost or afraid." Martha unfolded the letter with hands that shook so violently she could barely manage the task. The words swam before her eyes, partly from emotion and partly from the tears she couldn't hold back. "My dearest Martha," the letter began in Thomas's familiar script. "If you are reading this, then I have gone ahead of you to whatever lies beyond this mortal coil. Do not grieve over much, my love, for I have lived a full life in the few years I was blessed to call you my wife." The letter continued for several paragraphs, filled with Thomas's memories of their courtship, their wedding day, the births of their children. He wrote of his love for the Virginia soil they had farmed together, his hope that the war would end quickly and justly, his faith that their children would grow up in a better world than the one he was leaving behind. But it was the final paragraph that struck Martha like a physical blow. "I have asked Daniel to look after you and the children if I don't return, and I know he will honor that promise with his life. He loves you almost as much as I do, though he has never spoken of it and never would. If the worst happens, and if time shows that your heart might open again, know that you have my blessing to find happiness wherever it may lead. Daniel is a good man, Martha, perhaps better than I deserve to call friend. Trust him as you trusted me." Martha's sobs came without warning, great gasping sounds that frightened the children into running back to her side. Samuel wrapped his thin arms around her waist, while Rebecca patted her mother's hand with the grave concern of a child who had seen too much sorrow. "Mama, what's wrong?" Samuel demanded, his young voice cracking with the effort to sound brave. "Did that man hurt you?" "No, sweetheart," Martha managed between sobs. "He brought me news of your father. Good news in a way, though it's hard to understand." Captain Morrison had stepped back respectfully, giving the family space for their grief. But Martha looked up at him through her tears with a question that had been building since he first spoke. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you come here? Why seek me out? You could have kept the ring, sold it, forgotten about a dying Confederate's last words. What possessed you to travel all this way to find me?" The captain was quiet for a long moment, and Martha saw something in his face that she hadn't noticed before, a deep sadness that matched her own, the look of a man who had lost something precious. "I had a brother, Mrs. Whitfield, younger than me by 4 years, with the same fair hair as Private Hartwell. He died at Bull Run in the early days of the war, and I never got to say goodbye. No one brought me his last words or his personal effects. He was buried in a mass grave somewhere in Virginia, and I don't even know where." Understanding dawned in Martha's eyes. This Union captain had sought her out not just from duty, but from the hope that by honoring one family's need for closure, he might somehow find peace with his own unresolved grief. "When I found Private Hartwell dying," Captain Morrison continued, "he reminded me so much of my brother that I couldn't bear the thought of another family wondering, always wondering, what had become of their loved one. He made me promise to find you, yes, but I would have done it anyway. Everyone deserves to know how their story ends." Martha wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and looked at this strange man who had appeared like an answer to prayers. She hadn't known she was praying. The irony wasn't lost on her, a Union officer bringing her the most precious gift she could imagine, the truth about her husband's final days and the love that had sustained 2 young men through the horrors of war. "Captain Morrison," she said formally, would you join us for Sunday dinner? It isn't much, but it seems wrong to let you travel all this way without offering what hospitality I can." The captain looked surprised, then touched. "Ma'am, I wouldn't want to impose, especially given the current circumstances between our peoples." Samuel stepped forward with the sudden boldness of childhood. "Mama makes the best cornbread in all of Virginia, sir, and she tells stories about Papa that make you feel like you knew him." Martha smiled through her tears at her son's earnest invitation. "I think, Captain, that both our peoples have been hungry for far too long, in more ways than one. If you're willing to risk my cooking and my children's endless questions, you're welcome at our table." As they walked back toward the small farmhouse that Martha had somehow kept together through 3 years of war and widowhood, she found herself thinking about the strange turns that life could take. This morning she had been a widow struggling to raise her children alone, still grieving a husband whose death she had never fully understood. Now she carried his ring once again, along with his final words and the knowledge that he had been loved and honored even in death. The house itself bore witness to the war's toll. Windows boarded where glass had been broken, furniture that had been sold or burned for warmth, walls that needed paint and repairs Martha couldn't afford. But it was clean and well-ordered, a testament to her determination to maintain dignity even in reduced circumstances. "Rebecca, set another place at the table," Martha instructed as they entered. "Samuel, help me bring up some of the preserves from the cellar." As her children bustled about with the importance of preparing for company, Martha found herself studying Captain Morrison's face in the better light of her kitchen. The war had marked him, certainly. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of too many battles, too many decisions that haunted a man's sleep. But there was also a fundamental kindness there, a quality that had driven him to keep a promise to a dying enemy soldier. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said quietly while the children were out of earshot, "there's one more thing I should tell you about Private Hartwell's final moments." Martha paused in her preparations, sensing that whatever came next would be difficult to hear. "He spoke of you in those last minutes, not just about delivering the ring and the letter, but about you personally. He said—" The captain hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "He said he had loved you from afar for years, but had never spoken of it because you were his best friend's wife, and he was an honorable man." Martha's hand stilled on the wooden spoon she had been using to stir the pot of beans that would serve as their main dish. The revelation shouldn't have surprised her. Looking back, she could remember moments when Daniel's eyes had lingered on her face a bit too long, times when he had found excuses to help with farm work that Thomas was perfectly capable of handling himself. "He said," Captain Morrison continued, "that he hoped you would remember him kindly, and that taking Thomas's place in death was the only way he could think of to finally be worthy of your regard." Martha closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the sacrifice these two men had made. Thomas had died for his country and his family. Daniel had died carrying his friend's name, protecting Martha's future at the cost of his own identity and any recognition he might have earned. "He was a good man," she said finally. "They both were. This war has taken so much from all of us." Captain Morrison nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "I've been fighting for 3 years, Mrs. Whitfield, and I've learned that the line between enemy and friend is often thinner than either side wants to admit. Your husband and Private Hartwell died protecting what they loved, just as my brother did. The uniforms were different, but the love was the same." Rebecca came running back into the kitchen, her small face bright with excitement. "Mama, I picked the blue flowers from the garden for the table. Samuel says they're Papa's favorites." "Were Papa's favorites," Samuel corrected, with the painful precision of a child who had learned to speak of his father in the past tense. "But I think he would like them anyway." As Martha helped her daughter arrange the wildflowers in a chipped ceramic vase, she felt something shift inside her chest. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it no longer felt like a stone, blocking her ability to breathe. Instead, it had transformed into something else, a foundation of love and memory that could support new growth. Dinner was a simple affair by pre-war standards: beans flavored with the last of her preserved pork, cornbread made with precious hoarded meal, and early greens from the garden that had been more successful than she had dared hope. But Captain Morrison received it with the gratitude of a man who had been living on hardtack and whatever provisions the army could provide. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, after Samuel had asked a lengthy blessing that included thanks for the Yankee captain who brought Mama Papa's ring, "this is the finest meal I've had since leaving Connecticut." Rebecca beamed at the compliment, while Samuel peppered their guest with questions about life in the Union Army. Martha found herself relaxing for the first time in months as she watched her children interact with this kind stranger who had brought her such unexpected closure. "Captain Morrison," she said during a lull in the conversation, "may I ask what you plan to do after the war, assuming it ends soon, which we all pray it will?" The captain's face grew thoughtful. "I was a school teacher before the fighting started, Ma'am. In a small town not unlike this one, actually. I hope to return to that work, though I suspect it will be different now." "How do you teach children about the world when you've seen so much of what human beings can do to each other?" Martha nodded, understanding the question in a way that perhaps only other survivors could. "I think," she said slowly, "that you teach them about the other things human beings can do. Like keeping promises to dying men, like traveling across enemy territory to return a ring to a widow, like two friends loving each other enough that one would die carrying the other's name." The captain's eyes met hers across the simple wooden table, and she saw recognition there, the acknowledgement of one wounded soul by another. As the afternoon wore on, Captain Morrison proved himself to be exactly the kind of man Thomas's letter had suggested Daniel was. Thoughtful, gentle with the children, respectful of Martha's circumstances without being condescending about them. When Samuel showed him the small vegetable garden they were trying to coax back to life, he offered practical advice about soil preparation. When Rebecca shyly asked him to listen to her read from the family Bible, he gave her his complete attention, praising her pronunciation and comprehension. But it was during the quiet moments, when the children were playing outside and he helped Martha clean the dishes, that she began to see the man beneath the uniform. "Your husband was right about Private Hartwell," he said quietly, as they worked side by side at the wash basin. He was a good man. In those final moments, even dying, he was more concerned about keeping his promise to Thomas than about his own pain. Martha dried a plate slowly, considering her words. "Captain Morrison, may I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "Are you married? Do you have family waiting for you in Connecticut?" A shadow crossed his face. "I was engaged before the war began. A young woman named Catherine who taught at the school alongside me. But, well, 3 years is a long time, and the man who went to war isn't the same one who'll be coming home. She ended our engagement last Christmas in a letter that was probably kinder than I deserved." Martha heard the pain in his voice, the particular ache of loss compounded by understanding. "I'm sorry. This war has broken more hearts than we'll ever be able to count." "Perhaps," he said, then looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "But sometimes I think it brings together hearts that might never have found each other otherwise." The words hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Martha felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from a recognition of possibility that she hadn't allowed herself to consider since Thomas's death. "Captain Morrison," she began, then stopped, uncertain how to voice what she was thinking. "James," he said gently, "if we're to speak honestly with each other, I think we can dispense with military titles. James, then, what you've done today, bringing me Thomas's ring, his letter, the truth about what happened to him and to Daniel. It's given me something I didn't even know I needed. Closure, yes, but more than that. Hope." He nodded, understanding more than she had actually said. "Mrs. Whitfield, Martha, if I may, when I found Private Hartwell dying, he made me promise not just to find you, but to see that you were well, that you and your children were provided for. I couldn't leave without knowing that much, at least." Martha set down the dish she had been drying and turned to face him fully. "And what do you see?" "I see a woman of remarkable strength, who has kept her family together through circumstances that would have broken someone weaker. I see children who are polite, intelligent, and clearly loved. I see a home that, while marked by hardship, still radiates warmth and dignity." He paused, then continued with careful honesty. "I also see someone who has been alone for too long, carrying burdens that were meant to be shared." Martha's breath caught at the gentle accuracy of his observation. "The war will end soon, James. Everyone says so. What happens then? Do you return to Connecticut and resume teaching? Do we exchange letters occasionally, perhaps meet once or twice more to remember the friends we've both lost?" "I don't know," he admitted. "I know that I came here to fulfill a promise to a dying man, but I'm finding it difficult to imagine simply walking away now that I've met you and your children." The kitchen had grown quiet around them, filled with the weight of things being considered, but not yet spoken. Outside, Samuel and Rebecca's voices could be heard as they continued their play, the sound a reminder of the innocence that still needed protecting. "James," Martha said finally, "I want you to understand something. I loved Thomas deeply, and I always will. He was my first love, the father of my children, and his memory is precious to me. If I were ever to consider, well, any friendship that might develop between us would have to honor that." "Oh, of course," he replied immediately. "I would never ask you to set aside your love for your husband. What I'm hoping, perhaps foolishly, is that you might eventually find room in your heart for something new, alongside what has always been there." Martha looked at this kind, wounded man who had traveled so far to keep a promise and felt something she had thought was buried forever beginning to stir. It wasn't the passionate love of youth that she had shared with Thomas, that could never be replicated or replaced, but it was something else, perhaps no less valuable, the possibility of companionship, understanding, shared burdens, and gentle affection built on mutual respect and common loss. "The war isn't over yet," she said carefully. "Your unit will be moving on, and there are still battles to be fought. Even if we wanted to explore what might be possible between us, the timing—" "You're right," James acknowledged. "But wars do end, Martha. And when this one does, I hope you'll allow me to write to you, to court you properly, if you're willing, to see if what I think I'm feeling now might grow into something lasting." Martha nodded slowly, surprised by the lightness she felt at the prospect. "I think I would like that. But James, you should know that I'm not. My health isn't what it once was. The consumption—" "Are you dying?" he asked bluntly but not unkindly. "No," she said after a moment's consideration. "Not immediately, anyway, but I'm not strong anymore. I tire easily, and some mornings I can barely get out of bed. Any man who might consider a future with me should understand what he would be taking on." James stepped closer, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes. "Martha, I've spent 3 years watching young men die from bullets and disease and heartbreak. I've learned that none of us knows how much time we have, healthy or not. What matters isn't the length of our days, but what we do with them." The sound of running feet announced the return of her children, and Martha stepped back from the intimacy of the moment, though not without a small smile of promise. "Mama!" Rebecca burst through the door, her dress muddy and her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Samuel showed me how to skip stones like Papa used to, and I made one skip 4 times. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Martha said, smoothing her daughter's tangled hair. "I think it's time to say goodbye to Captain Morrison now. He has a long journey ahead of him." The farewells were more difficult than Martha had expected. Samuel shook James's hand with the serious dignity of a young man, thanking him for the stories about army life. Rebecca hugged his legs shyly and made him promise to come back soon. "I'll write," James said quietly to Martha as they stood in the doorway, "when the war ends, if not before." "I'll be here," she replied, then added with a small smile, "assuming the Yankees don't burn down the rest of Virginia before then." He laughed, and she was surprised by how much she enjoyed the sound. This Yankee, at least, has found something in Virginia worth preserving. As Martha watched him walk down the dirt road that led away from her farm, she fingered Thomas's ring, which she had decided to wear on a chain around her neck rather than on her finger. The symbolism felt right, keeping his memory close to her heart while leaving her hands free for whatever new work might come. That evening, after the children were asleep, she sat by candlelight and read Thomas's letter again. This time, his words about Daniel and about her own future happiness didn't bring tears, but a sense of peace. Thomas had known her well enough to understand that she wasn't the type of woman who could live happily alone forever. He had given her permission to love again, and in doing so had freed her from the guilt that might otherwise have poisoned any new relationship. She thought about James Morrison, about the careful way he had handled her children's questions and the respect he had shown for her circumstances. She thought about the promise in his eyes and the loneliness that she recognized in his bearing. They were both wounded by the war, both trying to find their way back to some version of the people they had been before the world went mad. But perhaps, she thought as she prepared for bed, wounded people were the best candidates for healing each other. Spring turned to summer, and summer to fall. The war ground on with its seemingly endless appetite for young men's lives. But Martha found herself paying less attention to the newspaper accounts that Samuel read aloud each evening. Instead, she focused on the small improvements she could make to their daily life, coaxing more vegetables from the garden, mending clothes that had been patched already, teaching Rebecca to read more advanced passages from the Bible. In late September, a letter arrived bearing a Connecticut postmark. Martha's hands trembled as she opened it, unsure what news it might contain. "Dear Martha," it began, "I hope this letter finds you and the children in good health. I write to you from a field hospital outside Richmond, where I am recovering from a minor wound received in our recent engagement. Please don't be alarmed, it is nothing serious, merely a reminder that I am not as quick as I once was. The letter continued with gentle inquiries about her health, the children's progress in their studies, and the state of the farm. But it was the final paragraph that made her heart race. The doctors say the war cannot last much longer now. When it ends, I intend to resign my commission and make my way back to Virginia if you will have me. I have thought of you and Samuel and Rebecca every day since I left your home, and I find that my desire to return has only grown stronger with time. If you are willing, I would like to ask formally for your permission to court you with marriage as my ultimate intention. I know that you must have many considerations, and I will understand if you cannot see your way clear to accepting my suit. But I hope that you can. Martha set the letter aside and walked to the window that overlooked the road James had taken when he left. The leaves were beginning to turn, painting the Virginia countryside in shades of gold and crimson that reminded her of hope after sorrow. She thought about the woman she had been when he first appeared by the river, broken by grief, worn down by hardship, focused solely on survival. That woman was still there, would always be part of who she was. But she was no longer the whole story. Over the months since James's visit, Martha had found herself looking forward instead of only backward, imagining possibilities instead of only remembering losses. The children had asked about him regularly, wondering when the nice Yankee captain would return. Samuel, in particular, had been fascinated by James's stories of life in Connecticut and had begun talking about what it might be like to live in a place where the war hadn't left its mark on every field and building. Martha picked up her pen and began her reply. "Dear James," she wrote, "I'm relieved to hear that your wound is healing and that you are safe. The children and I are well, though we think of you often and hope for your continued safety in these final months of fighting." She paused, considering her next words carefully. Outside, she could hear Rebecca singing to her corn-husked doll, a song about a soldier coming home. The sound decided her. "When the war ends and you are free to leave the army, you will be welcome here not as a visitor but as family, if that is truly what you desire. I cannot promise that the road ahead will be easy. We have little money, my health remains uncertain, and the work of rebuilding will be difficult, but I can promise that you will be loved and valued for exactly who you are, and that we will face whatever comes together. The children send their regards and look forward to hearing more of your stories. I find that I am looking forward to creating new stories of our own." As she sealed the letter, Martha felt Thomas's ring warm against her chest where it hung on its chain. She had no doubt that her first husband would have approved of the choice she was making. He had always wanted her to be happy, and he had trusted Daniel Hartwell's judgment about character. If Thomas had believed that Daniel could be trusted with his family's future, then surely he would extend that same trust to the man who had honored Daniel's final promise. The war did end, as James had predicted, in the spring of 1865. Martha learned of Lee's surrender from Samuel, who came running from the neighbor's farm where he had heard the news shouted by a passing rider. Instead of the celebration she might have expected, Martha felt only a profound sense of exhaustion mixed with relief. The dying was finally over. 3 weeks later, James Morrison appeared at her door. He was thinner than she remembered, marked by new lines around his eyes and a slight favoring of his left arm, where the wound was still healing. But his smile was the same, and the way Rebecca ran to him without hesitation told Martha everything she needed to know about her daughter's feelings on the matter. "You came," she said unnecessarily as he swept Rebecca up in his good arm. "I promised I would," he replied, setting the little girl down and extending his hand to Samuel, who shook it with the dignity of a young man welcoming another man into his family. That night, after the children had gone to bed and she and James sat on the front porch, talking quietly about his journey south and her experiences during the final months of the war, Martha made a decision that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. "James," she said, interrupting his description of the surrendering Confederate soldiers he had seen on his way to Virginia, "I don't want to wait for a long courtship. We're not young people anymore, and we've both lost too much time already. If you're serious about marriage, and if you can accept that Thomas will always be part of this family's history, then I'm ready to begin our life together as soon as arrangements can be made." James was quiet for a long moment, and Martha wondered if she had been too forward, too presumptuous about his feelings. "Martha," he said finally, "are you certain? I know that the practical considerations make sense. I can provide for you and the children, help with the farm work, offer protection and companionship, but I hope you know that what I feel for you goes far beyond practical considerations." Martha rose from her chair and moved to stand beside him at the porch railing, looking out over the land that had been hers and Thomas's, and would now be hers and James's. "I know," she said quietly, "and I want you to know that what I feel for you is real as well. Different from what I felt for Thomas, because I'm a different person now and you're not Thomas, but no less real, no less meaningful. I love you, James Morrison, for who you are and for the kindness you've shown my family, and I believe with time that love will only grow stronger." He turned to face her fully, taking her hands in his. "Then, let's not wait. Let's begin our life together as soon as the preacher can be arranged and the legal matters settled." They were married 6 weeks later in the small Methodist church that had somehow survived the war intact. Martha wore her best dress, carefully altered to fit her thinner frame, with wildflowers in her hair that Rebecca had insisted on picking herself. Samuel stood proudly as James's best man, while Rebecca scattered flower petals with the serious concentration of a child who understood the importance of the moment. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, attended by the few neighbors who remained and presided over by Pastor Williams, who had known Martha since childhood. When James slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, not replacing Thomas's ring, which remained on its chain around her neck, but joining it, Martha felt a sense of completion that she hadn't dared hope for. The years that followed were not easy, but they were rich with the kind of happiness that comes from shared purpose and mutual respect. James proved to be everything Thomas's letter had suggested Daniel would be: a devoted stepfather to Samuel and Rebecca, a skilled farmer who helped restore the land's productivity, and a gentle, patient husband who understood that healing took time. He never tried to replace Thomas in the children's memories or in Martha's heart. Instead, he created his own place alongside those existing bonds, adding new stories to the family's history rather than trying to erase the old ones. He taught Samuel advanced mathematics and encouraged the boy's growing interest in engineering. He read to Rebecca every night and listened with genuine interest to her increasingly sophisticated questions about the world beyond their farm. Martha's health, while never fully restored, stabilized under the care of a man who understood that love sometimes meant accepting limitations. James took over the heavier farm work without complaint, hired help when needed, and created a routine that allowed Martha to contribute meaningfully without overtaxing her weakened lungs. In the evenings, they would sit together on the porch he had rebuilt and expanded, watching their children play in the yard while they talked about their days, their hopes for the future, and occasionally about the past that had brought them together. Martha would sometimes catch James looking at Thomas's portrait, which held a place of honor on the mantelpiece, with an expression of gratitude rather than jealousy. "I never got to thank him," James said one evening, as they watched a spectacular sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. "Thank him for what?" Martha asked, though she suspected she knew. "For loving you so well that you learned how to love again." for raising children who knew how to welcome a stranger into their family, for being the kind of man who could inspire the loyalty that Daniel showed him, because without that loyalty, I never would have found you. Martha took his hand, noting how natural the gesture had become over their years together. I think he would have liked you, James. You're both good men who put their families before themselves. 5 years after their marriage, Samuel left for college in Richmond, his education funded by James's careful savings and his own scholarship earned through academic excellence. 3 years later, Rebecca married a young teacher from the neighboring county, a man who reminded Martha strongly of her second husband in his kindness and integrity. As Martha and James grew older together, they found a rhythm that suited them both. The farm prospered under James's careful management, providing not just subsistence, but modest prosperity. Martha's health remained fragile but stable, allowing her to enjoy the grandchildren who began arriving in due course. On quiet Sunday afternoons, they would sometimes walk to the river where they had first met, now accompanied by grandchildren who delighted in hearing the story of how Grandpa James had appeared like an answer to Grandma Martha's prayers, carrying a ring and a message from beyond the grave. "Tell us again about the ring, Grandma." Little Thomas, Samuel's eldest son, named for the grandfather he had never met, would plead, and Martha would tell the story once more, of two friends who loved each other enough that one would die carrying the other's name, of a Union officer who kept his promise to a Confederate soldier, of a widow who learned that the heart was capable of holding both grief and joy, loss and hope, the past and the future. The ring itself remained on its chain around Martha's neck until the day she died, peacefully in her sleep at the age of 68, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had known nothing but love and security in the home she and James had built together. In her will, she left the ring to Samuel with instructions that it should be passed down through the generations, as a reminder that love could transcend even the bitterest divisions, and that the greatest courage sometimes lay not in fighting, but in the willingness to trust, to forgive, and to begin again. James lived another 7 years after Martha's death, spending his remaining time teaching school in the town that had grown up around their farm, and telling anyone who would listen about the remarkable woman who had taught him that it was never too late to find love, never too difficult to start over, and never impossible to build something beautiful from the ruins of what had been lost. When he died, surrounded by the children who called him father and the grandchildren who had known no other grandfather, his last words were of gratitude to Thomas Whitfield for loving Martha so well, to Daniel Hartwell for keeping his promise, and to Martha herself for showing him that sometimes the greatest victories come not from conquest but from surrender, not from taking but from giving, not from demanding love but from offering it freely and without reservation. They buried James beside Martha in the small cemetery behind the Methodist church, their graves marked with simple stones that bore their names, their dates, and a single line that captured the essence of their story. Love found a way. The ring, meanwhile, continued its journey through the generations, carried by Samuel's children and their children after them, each generation adding new chapters to the story of how love had triumphed over loss in a small Virginia town during the nation's darkest hour, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapons against hatred and division are simple human kindness, the willingness to keep promises, and the courage to believe that tomorrow can be better than yesterday, no matter how dark today might seem.